In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the influences of evolutionary theory on psychology, and in particular on modern psychology. Now that may seem to be kind of strange because evolutionary theory was proposed back in the mid-1800s by Charles Darwin. How is it that it's having its influences on psychology only now? Well, actually, it did have influences on early psychology, and in particular psychoanalytic theory that we're going to talk about later in the course. Psychoanalytic theory has alludes to instinctive kinds of things. Much of the id, when we talk about psychoanalytic theory, is instinctive in nature. And so there was some influence of Darwin and evolutionary theory on psychology in early psychology. However, the behaviorists then came along in about 1910 or so, and they so took over psychology that we ignored altogether anything being built in, because they very much assumed the John Locke position of having a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, and this was to be written upon by learning. So learning became the cornerstone of psychology, and for almost half a century, only learning was studied in psychology. And people forgot all about evolutionary theory. And there are reasons for this, not only in psychology, but there are some political reasons for that as well that we won't go into today. And then in the 1960s, you'll recall that cognitive psychology came along. And cognitive psychology also operated to some extent on a blank slate principle. Again, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, and the computer metaphor being used in cognitive psychology, where you had the large mainframe computer, but not much was built in. And in fact, this was written upon by human experience in terms of an analog of forming software programs with your human experience. And so people didn't think much about evolutionary psychology, and evolutionary theory had little to do with psychology. This has changed. And in the 1990s in particular, the theory of evolutionary psychology actually was named, and there has been a great deal of research in evolutionary psychology today. Now, I want to talk about evolutionary psychology a little bit at this point in order to prepare you for looking at some of the more traditional areas of psychology, because I think it's informative to do that and look at some of these from an evolutionary sense. So we're going to go over some of the basics of the theory today, what Darwin actually said was required for evolution. Then we're going to look some at some of the people who have adapted evolutionary theory in recent times to the human and human behavior. Then we're going to look at several misunderstandings about evolutionary theory as applied to human behavior and why those misunderstandings are indeed misunderstandings. And finally, we'll discuss evolutionary psychology in terms of the way belief systems are changed and some terms like naturalistic fallacy. So let me get started by talking some about what Darwin actually said. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book called On the Origin of Species. Charles Darwin was a naturalist, and he had studied in school in order to be able to look at plants and animals and how they develop the way they do. And he took a cruise on a boat called the Beagle and went to, in particular, the Galapagos Islands. And while on the Galapagos Islands, he studied all sorts of different natural phenomena and collected lots of different kinds of species and did extensive writing. And when he came back, he had to try to decide what this all meant. And what he eventually came up with was the theory of evolution. Now, there was somebody else who came along about the same time and proposed the theory of evolution, but Charles Darwin is usually given the credit for being the father of evolution. And he proposed that there are really just three basic processes required for evolution. It's really pretty simple, but widely misunderstood by people. The first of those processes is inheritability. You have to have some way that the genetic message is passed down from parent to offspring. And Charles Darwin, rather surprisingly, didn't know much about how this happened. And he was mistaken about how this happened. And we'll see in just a minute when I talk about Mendel that this was an update really on Charles Darwin. They lived about the same time, but in fact he was not familiar, or at least did not use Mendel's work in his theory of evolution. But he knew that somehow the message had to be transmitted from the parent to the offspring. A second thing that's required is variation. And this variation occurs through mutation or through sexual reproduction. And in this way, variation is passed down to the offspring. In terms of mutation, what happens is a mistake is made, basically. When the genetic material is selected from one of the parents or the other, a change is made in the genetic material and a different adaptation is made, which might cause a structural or behavioral difference in the offspring, which is simply a matter of a mistake. You also get some variation by sexual reproduction. One of the nicer things about sexual reproduction, other than the obvious, is the fact that it produces variation. You have the parents each making a contribution to the genetic outcome of the offspring, and there's sort of a roulette wheel that is spun every time we have a child, and it picks off genetic messages from the parents and from the grandparents, and we get kind of a hodgepodge of genetic messages that do produce some variation. So inheritability, variation, and the third thing that's required is some form of selection. Now this selection in Darwin's sense is naturalistic selection, natural selection, or what is sometimes called survival of the fittest. But it doesn't have to be that. You could have selection which is not natural. You can have breeding, for example. For example, we take racehorses and we try to breed racehorses. And we breed them so they have these little thin legs and very powerful muscles and are very fast. And they're good for racing, unless they break their leg. They're not very good for plow horses. We breed them for a specific purpose. And this is a form of selection. But usually you have natural selection. And all this means is that once one of these mistakes is made and you get variation, that mistake will stick around if it allows the offspring to be more successful, to survive longer and reproduce better. Then it is selected through natural selection and stays as part of evolution. So those are the basic three things that are required for evolution, and only those three things. Now subsequently, that was a long time ago that Darwin suggested these things, and since then there have been a number of things that have happened that kind of update evolution, and in particular update evolution so that it can include humans. The first one happened about the same time as Darwin, and that's Gregor Mendel, who was an Austrian monk who was studying inheritance, and he used plants for the most part to do this. And I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with what Mendel did. He bred plants that were tall and plants that were short, and came up with the notion that the genetic material was particulate. That is, you don't get mixed messages, you get one message depending upon what genetic material has been selected for the offspring. Up until that time, and Darwin thought that this was the case, a lot of people thought that there was blending, that you had a father and a mother, and the offspring were some blended combination. So if you have a very tall mother and a very short father, as their genes are blended, you'll get a medium-sized offspring. And that's not true. As Mendel showed, they get either the tall gene or the short gene, at least if it's a single gene case. In polygenic traits, there are various genes that may be combined in different ways, but for the simple cases, you only get one gene, and it's a particulate. And it's either the mother's gene or the father's gene. And that was somewhat new to people, and we now understand more about the inheritability part of evolutionary theory because of Gregor Mendel's work. Ethologist Konrad Lorenz, far more recently, he's an ethologist, and he was studying animal behavior for the most part. And he was one of the first to show that there are innate behavior patterns that have developed as evolutionary adaptations, and that these are triggered by environmental cues. One of his more famous studies, he took goslings that had just been born to the mother goose, and as they're hatched, the goslings look around, and one of the things that's built into them is an innate tendency to follow the first large moving object that crosses their field. And that happened to be Konrad Lorenz, in fact. And so as Konrad Lorenz walked around, these goslings all lined up behind him and followed him along. You may have seen the picture of him walking along with a whole string of goslings following him along. And they have this built into them, a fixed behavior pattern that simply says, follow the large moving object as soon as you're born. It's called imprinting. And so they do this. And it doesn't matter to them whether it's the mom or Konrad Lorenz. They're the equivalent to this fixed action pattern that simply follows this what's called sign stimulus. And this was one of the first times, and Lorenz showed this not only in goslings but in lots of other animals, that there are these fixed behavior patterns that can occur at least in animals. Biologist William Hamilton in the mid-60s proposed a kind of a new twist to evolutionary theory, and that's a topic called inclusive fitness. Up until this time, it was thought that fitness was pretty much parent to child. And so if you had an adaptation that was passed down to your offspring that would increase that child's fitness, that then was direct fitness. But what Hamilton showed was that there's also a topic of inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness says that it's important not only the reproductive success of your direct offspring, but also the reproductive success of genetic relatives. So, for example, if you are going to be altruistic, you might be altruistic and do good things for your children, because indeed they are your genes that are being carried along, but you might also do good things for your brother or your sister who share part of your genes. And you might do good things for your sister or brother's offspring as well, your nieces and nephews, because they share some of your genes. So this altruistic behavior should be spread around. This got people to thinking about the genes in a somewhat different way. And it sort of became the new unit of evolution. Up until this time, the individual was kind of the unit of evolution. That in fact it was the survival of the individual that was important. This adaptation to this theory said it's the gene's survival that's important. The gene is the basic genetic unit. And we're just big bags of water. We're life support systems to carry around genes for a finite period of time. We're mortal after all. The genes are seeking to be immortal. And so they're far more concerned about your reproduction and the next generation that they can live in and become immortal. So the unit of survival is now the gene, not the individual. And that makes a big difference in terms of the way you look at evolution. Robert Trivers came along in the 1970s and proposed three theories that also extended evolutionary thinking. One of these was reciprocal altruism. I just mentioned altruism with respect to your own kin. Reciprocal altruism has to do with whether we can do good things for other people. And he said that there was an adaptive advantage to reciprocal altruism. That if you do something good for somebody else, they're likely to do something good for you. In evolutionary times, suppose you come back from the hunt with a big leg of meat, and you bring that back, and you don't have any storage facilities, you don't have any way, you can't eat the whole leg, your own family, and so you might invite other people to share this leg of meat with you, and you don't get any direct benefit at the time. Why should you do that? Well, because next week, maybe this individual will come back from the hunt and have his own leg of meat, and might share with you. So reciprocal altruism became important. Also, parental investment theory was suggested. With parental investment theory, this says that women and men invest far differently in their offspring. Women invest at least 9 months, and with lactation probably more like at least 3 or 4 years, in raising the offspring, and in actual fact, probably more like 10 years in raising an offspring. And men, on the other hand, at least in terms of minimal investment, may invest 30 seconds or a minute in producing offspring. And if that's the case, we would expect different patterns of behavior for women and for men. We might expect pickier women in terms of picking a man who will provide resources for the offspring during this period of time that she's investing in them. The man might have different values if this is the case. He might find it more important to have women who are attractive and who, in fact, are quite fertile. That might be a different value system that would be suggested by parental investment theory. Finally, he also suggested parent-offspring conflicts. And this is obvious because, in fact, the parent is related to each of their offspring by the same amount. So as a parent, I think my two sons ought to share equally in things. They don't think that. My son, because he's related 100% to himself, my older son thinks he ought to get twice of everything that his younger brother gets, because he's only related 50% to his younger brother. And the younger brother feels the same way about the older brother. So we get into conflicts, because I think they ought to share, they think they ought to distribute the resources in a different way. In 1975, E.O. Wilson published Sociobiology, the New Synthesis. And this was a quite controversial book at the time, because he included a chapter in evolution with respect to humans. And this was one of the first times that it was suggested that evolution could be applied to humans. And it was really the beginning, even though he's a biologist, he's not a psychologist, but it was the beginning of evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary thinking, as I've mentioned before in a former lecture, is a way of asking why questions as well as what and how questions. And that's part of the reason it's kind of exciting. Okay, let me now talk about some of the misunderstandings about evolutionary theory as applied to human behavior. One common misunderstanding is a false nature-nurture dichotomy. And people often get it wrong with respect to evolutionary theory. They think that people who are supporting evolutionary theory think that if it's built in, the environment has nothing to do with it. When in fact, most modern-day evolutionary theorists think it's both nature and nurture. The old nature versus nurture arguments have really gone by the wayside as quite naive, that it's always nature and nurture, according to modern-day evolutionary theorists. A good example of this is suntanning. If I asked you, is it nature or nurture that gives you the color of your skin? You might say, well, I suppose it's nature. But in fact, if you stay out in the sun longer, you turn darker. At least light-skinned people do. They do that because of an adaptation. We have built into us melanin synthesis so that when we're exposed to UVB sunlight, our skin turns darker. That happens because it helps us to avoid skin cancer. The darker we turn, the less of the UVB that we get, and it's UVB that causes skin cancer. So this is nature's way of giving us an umbrella to protect us from the sun and keep us from getting skin cancer. So why aren't we all just dark as can be? Well, because there's another thing that the sun does for us as well, and that's vitamin D. And we get vitamin D from the sun, and that's an important nutrient that we need to survive. So we have to get some sunlight, but not too much sunlight. And so there is an adaptation built into us through melanin that allows us to put more of the sunshade up or less of the sunshade up by changing the color of our skin. Now, if I asked, is the color of your skin due to built-in kinds of things, to nature? Sure is. If you didn't have this adaptation, you wouldn't turn darker. Is it due to the environment? Well, of course it's due to the environment. If you didn't have the sun turning your skin darker, it wouldn't get darker. So in fact, it is nature and nurture, not nature versus nurture. And we can point that out in nearly every case, that adaptations are not adaptations where they set off some pattern that's irrevocable, but in fact that pattern, that adaptation works with the environment, and it's the combination of those two things that cause our behavior. In a similar way, intelligence is certainly not all built in. People get very upset about these kinds of arguments sometime when we're trying to indicate that intelligence is due to the intelligence of your parents. Well, it is due to that, but it's also due to the environment that you grow up in. That's why we do things like hang mobiles over children's cribs and things like that to try to change their intelligence through the environment. So it's a combination of those things. A second misunderstanding is that if an adaptation is built in, that you can't change it. That if it's that way, then you can't step in and do something else. And again, that is not true. We do have the ability to use logical thought to override behavioral adaptations. These behavioral adaptations give us predispositions to behaving a particular way, but are not deterministic in saying you have to behave that way. And this is quite apparent when you have the ability to change things like the intelligence through the environment. A third misunderstanding is that current adaptations, the way you are now, is optimal. And that's certainly not the case. Why? Because the current adaptations are due to our ancestral history, not due to today's environment. If you put the whole year, if you take a year and claim that it's the time that humans have been around, which is about 5 million years, some form of human has been around, and you put that on a year, and you ask where certain kinds of modern things have happened in that year's time. For example, when did agriculture occur during this year period of time? Agriculture occurred, as I recall, about 9 o'clock on the last day of the year. Prior to that, there was no agriculture. We didn't till the fields prior to that. When did cities and civilization occur? That occurred at about 11:30, as I recall, during this year. When did the Industrial Revolution occur? That occurred within minutes of midnight during this year. Where did our adaptations occur? They occurred through most of this year's period of time, not during the last half day of this period of time. So it's not surprising that we have mismatches of the way we behave and the way today's society is. It is not optimal, the way we behave. Let me give you an example of that. We love fat and sugar in our diets. I mean, I would love to be able to eat. I don't do it because I override it. It can be changed. But I would love to eat every piece of bacon I see. I would love to be able to eat every Twinkie I see. I love, and you do too, fat and sugar. And we're built that way on purpose. Our ancestors seldom ran across fat and sugar. The animals, even meats back in those days, had 5% or less fat, not the 40% fat that we get on our well-bred meat today. They didn't get sugar. We eat about 2/3 of a cup of sugar every week, and they didn't have refined sugar. They'd run across a beehive every now and then or have a little sugar with their fruit. But they didn't have sugar readily available in their diet, so every time they had a chance at it, they ate it. They also had an adaptation that said, don't move if you don't have to. They were the ultimate couch potatoes because that's the way you survive. When you have to go out and hunt, you go out and hunt. But when you don't, you lie around and don't waste that energy. So we have that built into us too. And if you look at today's society, that causes all sorts of problems, in particular obesity and other health problems. Why we are having a current wave of, we get better and better at putting more sugar and fat into our diet. We get better and better at not having to move a bit once we sit down. And as we do that, we have all sorts of health problems that are caused. Is that optimal? It most certainly isn't optimal. And so, in fact, that's a mismatch. And we will point out other mismatches as well as we get into more detail about evolution later. Okay, let's talk about just a few things having to do with some caveats that we want to make with respect to evolutionary theory. For one thing, evolutionary theory, we have to agree, is, in fact, the most widely accepted theory about how we got to be the way we are. However, the scientific belief system itself is just a theory. And there are other belief systems that we might hold. If you're going to be an educated person, you probably better know about evolutionary theory as one of the major components of the scientific belief system. But if you'll recall back when we were talking about experimentation, for example, we said that if you manipulate an independent variable, measure a dependent variable, then you can say that it was the independent variable that caused the dependent variable. And why did we agree that we could do that? Well, because that's what we believe. Basically, scientists got together and said, we're going to believe this thing, it seems to work, and so we're going to decree that that's the way it is. And that's our belief system. That's the scientific belief system. But there are other personal belief systems that people can have and that might compete and perhaps run in parallel with the scientific belief system. Evolutionary psychology is also sometimes criticized as being too post hoc, after the fact. That in fact my grandmother could have told me that kinds of things. So we already know an awful lot about human behavior, and so we kind of know how humans are going to behave to begin with, and we go back to evolutionary theory and we say, what can we justify from evolutionary theory to explain this kind of behavior? And we discover we can explain it quite nicely. The problem is that if we had behaved differently in the first place, and we knew that we were, we might have gotten a different cover story from evolutionary psychology. And the people who are critical of this say that because it's so post hoc, we can explain anything we might want to explain. And that probably was a criticism fairly early on in evolutionary psychology. However, that's advanced to the point now where lots of behaviors that are not obvious are being explained, and I think that is a weakening kind of criticism of evolutionary theory. Finally, there is a danger in applying what's called the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy says basically that if it's natural, that must be the way it's supposed to be. And so we justify things that we shouldn't be justifying using the naturalistic fallacy. Now, we've already talked a little bit about why that is not an appropriate way to do things, because of things like mismatches. So, if we have different behaviors, say for men and women, that are predicted by adaptations that have occurred left over from ancestral times, it is inappropriate for us to say, well, that's the way it should be. It's okay for women to be that way. It's okay for men to be that way because that's what's built in. Because there may be an entire mismatch with the way we want our society to be or the way modern day societies are. Just like it's not okay to eat all the fat and all the sugar that's provided, there's a mismatch. It's not the society we want to have today, unless we want to have everybody lying in bed highly obese. In fact, the naturalistic fallacy is a fallacy. What I think is most important is understanding what the causes of behaviors are, at least behavioral predispositions. If you want to change society, it's best to know what our behavioral adaptations are to begin with, if we want a society that's different from that. And to go in naively and pretend that there are no built-in adaptations probably hurts us in trying to build the kind of society we want to build. So what we've done today is go quickly over evolutionary theory. We have done this so that we might be able to apply some of this as we're talking about the rest of psychology. We talked a little bit about how the behaviorists and the cognitive psychologists kind of accepted a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and how Charles Darwin came along and suggested that there might be some things built in, how those Built-in things are accomplished through inheritability, variation, and selection. And then we talked about some of the more modern adaptations that have changed the basic theory of evolution. And we talked about some of the misunderstandings that occur with evolutionary thinking, including the false nature-nurture dichotomy, how some people think you can't change it, and how some people think that it's optimal. And finally, we talked about some caveats you have to employ when you talk about evolutionary thinking. So we're going to leave it at there, and I hope you will consider these things as we go on to the other topics in this course. Thank you.